Can I believe what I see? Information-Theoretic algorithm validation. Please, Joachim.
So thank you very much, Christian, for the introduction. I'm very grateful for the organizers to invite me here. We live in very exciting times. The digital revolution is basically penetrating all the scientific fields. And the question is, when we start automatically identifying patterns in our data, can we actually believe the results? So originally I committed to this title because it's very close to my research interests, and I think it's also relevant for the community. But more recently I thought maybe the subtitle is Quo Vadis Artificial Intelligence? Where will we go with AI and what are the challenges there? So we live in a world full of data, and in the 50s, von Neumann was looking at this type of computers. Today we have the huge compute centers, but with all this computing and all this data, you need to make sense out of it, and what makes sense out of this resource are algorithms. And the algorithms are essentially converting data into values. And the question is, how can you do that automatically, not having the human in the loop? Now, pattern analysis is difficult. So who sees something in this picture? The Dalmatian dog everybody knows, but here, what do you see? I give you a brief hint. Okay, so those who don't see anything may want to consult their neurologist, but sometimes it takes a little bit longer. You know all these pictures which are ambiguous, and the ambiguity there is in the visual domain. You know, it's depending on context and sometimes even on your hormonal status, but that's basically one of the challenges. We have to make sense out of this data, and when the data live in very high dimensions, we have the tendency to see patterns everywhere. So what is the purpose of visualization, and what am I actually doing here? Well, it's exploratory data analysis. Humans search for structure in data, and they want to use these structures to build models. Models not necessarily how to generate the data, but how to make sensible decisions with data. And in particular, you want to validate these models. That means you have to somehow see whether the data and their interpretations are plausible. Now, you also want to use visualization for extracting the knowledge from experts. The crisis of AI in the 80s and 90s was particularly because we couldn't get the knowledge out of the heads of experts. And in particular in medicine, doctors are much better in actually acting on the patient, having an impact on the patient, than actually inspecting themselves what they are doing. So don't ask them too early, what are you thinking about my disease, because then they switch into introspection mode, and we know that the performance is significantly dropping. You also want to communicate the results, and that's my last message. Here in that small video, what you see is you see an interpretation of a mass spectrum data. The nucleic acids are listed below the respective mass points. And what I want to emphasize is you should always report probabilities of the interpretation. That's what we have to learn. How certain is the system to actually come up with such an interpretation? Information technology for personalized medicine. This slide is prototypical for a huge range of applications, not only in medicine but also in sociology, in finance, and many other governmental organizations and so on. Many other areas where you need semi-qualitative or weakly quantitative type of modeling with predictive value. So you have data, you convert this data with the help of the doctors into information, you want to extract knowledge out of this data, then it's our knowledge as a society, and in the end it's the value. But in medicine it's not only the smile on the face of the patient, it's this. It's a probability as a function of the time to survive. And everybody is interested in that. The doctors, the insurance companies, and in particular also the patients. The point I want to make is, here, you need about maybe a kilobyte, 10 kilobytes, and you start out with probably hundreds of gigabytes or a terabyte. Where in the pipeline do we lose the bits which actually tells you something about the Kaplan-Meier plots? That's the real challenge. And there's a lot of tuning, a lot of hand adapting in this whole pipeline, but in the future we will build these pipelines automatically, having sort of construction algorithms for designing algorithms. And then you need criteria how to make progress. Otherwise, you will start reading the tea leaves. So what are algorithms? All of you know that. That's why I can go very briefly over this definition. And for my audience in medicine, I usually have this flow chart of an algorithm. You have a starting point. You have some terminal nodes. They are color-coded to give you a bit of semantic information, what's going on. And you have a lot of in-between. We used to have a very good understanding of algorithms with respect to their runtime and their memory consumption. What we are not used to is that we ask questions like, how well does my algorithm actually generalize? Is my algorithm robust against misspecification, slight misspecifications? And that is sort of the core of the deficit I see, or let's put it positively, the core of the challenge I see for our community. And it's not only for our community, there are no solutions anywhere in the scientific realm for these questions. The point I want to make is algorithms, learning algorithms in particular, are exploring reality, the complexity of reality. And that's what we have to grasp. An algorithm is not sort of an auxiliary procedure to do something with a model. The algorithm is for all these applications being modeled. So, algorithms for data analysis. What is the real problem? The problem is that when you have random inputs, and for sure in all these applications I listed, the input is a random variable. If you have a random input, then the output is random. So how do we deal with random outputs? In this particular example, I would to highlight, so that's a gene expression analysis example. You have your gene expression data, you convert them into a correlation matrix, and then you interpret this as a graph with weights on the edges. Important is that your input, X, is drawn from a probability distribution. So we assume that basically the axioms of Kolmogorov for probabilistic reasoning, the axioms hold. That's our assumption. And then you pump this into an algorithm and you get your result. Now the output C in this particular example is a labeling, a coloring of your graph, but you should perceive C as a random variable which is drawn from a posterior probability distribution. And this looks like a takeover of computer science questions by statistics, but I think it's the core of the challenge. If your input is random, your output is random, and all of a sudden it's not so clear anymore what it means that your algorithm is correct. So the question is, you have an algorithm, I have an algorithm. On what basis do we decide which algorithm is better solving my problem? So the core questions I think are now the following. How to validate, I put data science in parentheses because I think it applies even to a broader realm of algorithms than just data science algorithms. As I pointed out, since Kolmogorov, we know that when the input is random, the output is random. Since Shannon, we know that algorithms should deliver to us typical solutions. Typical solutions might not be the most probable solutions. The most probable sequence of a coin flip of a thousand flips with head 60% and tail 40% is a sequence with only heads. So the minimizer of the negative log likelihood is a solution which you will not observe. And that should make you thinking, because a lot of engineering solutions today are based on the negative log likelihood principle of complicated cost functions. So quite often we are not punished for this because we don't find the global minimum. But we are getting better and better in that, and that's why we have to actually find solutions for it. Since Watnik, we know that we have to ask what is the generalization ability of algorithms, and I would say the next challenge is how can algorithms autonomously improve their performance. Algorithms have to adapt to data, and the data might live in such high-dimensional spaces that we as humans have a very hard time to explore them. And so if we want to go for automatic tools, then we have to solve this problem. Why is that solvable at all? Well, I believe the human brain gives us an indication that it's solvable, at least when complexity is not too high. And we rebuilt sort of these ideas in the 90s with artificial neural networks. That's basically when I started in this game. Today you have the same type of architecture, deep face for face recognition, and Yann LeCun claims that the face recognition problem, at least for Facebook's purposes, is fairly well solved with that architecture. Now, if you look what these networks do, so this is sort of my only visualization slide here, and it's also borrowed from Sebastian Novotzin from MSRI in Cambridge. You see that the network hallucinates sort of in a dream fashion. The point I want to make is, these neural networks need humans to tell them what should come out when a certain input is given. Without annotation, we have a very hard time to actually train these types of networks. Now you might say, AlphaGo. Yes, AlphaGo doesn't need human, at least AlphaGo 0, doesn't need human knowledge, but the constraints by the game are so tight that the computer can play its own supervision instance. So in real life, the situation is way too complex, and we actually have to think about how we make progress without human annotation in real life situations. And that's particularly the case when you go to medical applications. So the question is, what is missing? And I claim what is missing is the scientific method. What is the scientific method? You all learned about this. You ask questions, you propose hypotheses, you conduct your experiments, you analyze your results, and then you go in a very tight feedback loop to new experiments, new results, new experiments, and so on. And at the end, you commit to a theory, and you go back with that theory and you ask new questions. That's how we refined it. I would say Galileo is probably the first who pushed this systematic approach to gain knowledge to a certain extreme. And that's how we look at this automatic knowledge generation process. Today, you have algorithms at every one of these edges. So all these edges are implemented by algorithms. Experimental design, data analysis for experiments, even theory abstraction is done by algorithmic tools. The human is very good. As humans, we understand this method, and we don't need a blind dog of our colleague to guide us into new territories. So if we can manage to algorithmatize this principle, then I believe that you get closer to real artificial intelligence. So the roadmap I want to follow is the following. I told you something about this general motivation. We have worked on a validation scheme for algorithms when you don't have ground truths from humans. based on information theory, so I hope to give you a cartoon type overview of how this might go. And then I have a couple of examples to come back to my second question, quo vadis artificial intelligence. Algorithm validation. I might also apologize, my talk is not completely free of formulas. So, yes, but those who know me shouldn't have expected this. The next two slides should give you an idea how I believe that Shannon's concept of information theory could be adapted to algorithm theory. So let's look at the following. The green space is my data space, and the yellow space is my solution space. And in analogy to what I motivated before, we take a graph and we take the graph coloring problem, community detection or something like this, the graph coloring problem as a case study. The space of data is 2 to the power of n choose 2. If I have only binary edges. If I have real valued edges, it's r to the power of n choose 2. That's more than exponentially growth. The output space is k to the n when I have k colors. It's also exponentially large, and most of these problems are NP hard, which I think is not the relevant question to be asked, but just to give you an idea that we have very large input and output spaces. But the point I want to make is the input space usually in these applications is much, much larger, exponentially larger than the output space, despite the fact that the output space is already exponentially large. So a strategy which actually points towards reconstructing the input might solve a too hard problem. So I'm a strong believer in the discriminative view of computer science of machine learning, because all of computer science, I believe, is discriminative in that sense. My data are random, so my graph is drawn from a probability distribution of graphs. Now I have my algorithm, and the algorithm maps in the output space. Since my input is random, I also get a distribution in the output space. The real problem now is you have another algorithm and the distribution in the output space is better concentrated. Or maybe a third algorithm and it's more spread out. What is the right resolution in the output space when you have uncertainty in the input space? That's the question. And it certainly depends on the algorithms, because some algorithms are like dirty classes and others are like really sharp classes. So let's assume that this is the right resolution. What I need is an alternative. So I apply a transformation to my input distribution, but the transformation is not supposed to change my measurements. So what comes out, the numbers which come out of my experiment have to be preserved. But the representation of my input relative to my output is at my discretion. This is to be defined. And what I mean by that, the labeling of the vertices of a graph is man-made. It's not predefined by the experiment, it's our annotation. And this is a way of implementing these types of transformations. So we shift it, we apply now these transformed data to our algorithm, and this is my output distribution. So I get here a different output distribution, and you see the distributions effectively partition my output space in equivalence classes. Shannon told us you should do that n times, and that implies that you have an exponentially rich partitioning of your output space into different equivalence classes, where all the solutions within an equivalence class is supposed to be statistically indistinguishable. Now, this picture assumes that you know what the input distribution is, and in almost all cases you don't. So you have to adapt to this. And on my second slide, I like to adapt now. So let's see, we have this experiment for graphs, but I see only one graph. Now I have a large graph, an instance drawn from that probability distribution. I again apply my algorithm and it gives me exactly one labeling as output. Now you sample your source and you get more outputs. The sample average approach in optimization actually now does that as often as possible to get an output distribution. Maybe we have a different approach if we don't have so many experiments. So let's assume that I replace my algorithm with a probability distribution which is motivated, a posterior probability distribution which is motivated by this algorithm. Then again I have the problem, how precise should it be? Like this, for algorithm A prime, for algorithm A double prime, a broad distribution. That's the question. And I need a mathematical criterion to determine this precision, because that allows me to measure the informativeness of an algorithm relative to the uncertainty in the input. Let's assume this is the right thing. You do this m times, you get your coverage in the output space, and now you can ask, how do I determine the correct width of the algorithms, of the distribution, the output distribution? So let's now draw a second sample from that distribution, the blue one. So these sticks always mean that you have a Dirac measure for your output. You can now apply one of the transformations which we defined before to effectively shift this blue data point down here as if it would be drawn from this distribution. Now you map it to the output space. And you see in the output space there is a good correlation between the red distribution and one of the blue distributions. In such a case, you would say, I can identify the correct transformation. And that's basically what we want to use. If I can identify the correct transformation, I have not overcommitted in terms of precision in the output space to solutions, and that means I am not affected by the noise of the input. So, mathematically speaking, what I'm advocating is that you use a communication protocol not because you want to communicate, but because you want to decide about the right precision of approximation in the output space when your input is noise perturbed. So you have, in the Shannon picture, you have a sender. The channel is for me a problem generator where I draw new instances, and then I have a receiver. And the sender now applies a transformation tau s to the new input x double prime. That gives me my x tilde data set. And x and x prime are drawn from the same probability distribution. And now you try to correlate with one of the codebook, sort of the sample distributions on the first data set with the new distribution on the second data set. So this is this correlation here. And you take the transformation which maximizes that correlation, and this is your guess for the output transformation. Mathematically speaking, you take the expectation of the posterior, of the transformed posterior on the second data set, and you evaluate that posterior for solutions which you hypothesize to be drawn by the probability distribution PC of tau applied to x prime. So you take the expectation over the blue distribution and check how likely the posterior is from the red distribution. When you take this example, you can now define an error event, and the error event is exactly when tau hat disagrees with tau s. And so you have to calculate the probability distribution of an error. So this is my probability distribution of an error conditioned on this trial transformation. And when you calculate now this distribution, what you will get is a criterion to validate an algorithm, because the algorithms are built into these posteriors. So how do you do this optimization? Let's assume you are interested in optimizing your costs, and that means you have a cost function R, and I recommend in the motivation of information theory to take a posterior Gibbs distribution as the posterior probability distribution, and it's maximally robust. For example, you could implement it with simulated annealing or deterministic annealing or many other types of belief propagation algorithms, for example. They all do this job. And what you see here is then for the k-means algorithm a split, and in particular look at the traces of these centroids. I have 3 Gaussians and 5 cluster centers, and you see it's very precise up to the point when you need more than 3 cluster centroids, and then it's getting noise influenced. And you see this even better in the following simulation. These are now 2 different samples drawn from the same probability distribution. Again, it's splitting. It's consistent up to the point when you use 3 clusters, and from the point on, when you use the 4th and the 5th cluster, you see the arbitrariness. And the arbitrariness then gives you a different result at the end. And from what you see here is a sampling. It is a sampling of the voxels being assigned to a particular cluster according to these estimated labelings for this particular algorithm. So the uncertainty is here visualized by a stochastic path of your algorithm. That is the motivation for the theory. Now, I told you I have 2 samples from my experiment because epistemologically I believe if you have only one experiment, you can never distinguish between the signal and the noise. Because nature could be malicious and exactly presents you with this signal, which is so complex. You need a second experiment to actually see what the deviations are. So we have x prime and x double prime, 2 data sets from the same data source. I have my posterior P A of C given x prime, my posterior for given the second data set, and they have to agree. So the solutions have to work on both posteriors. So you sum over the solutions since they are random anyway, and you get a kernel. And the kernel now is a similarity measure between x prime and x double prime, and this similarity measure is mediated by the algorithm. So the algorithm induces a similarity between 2 inputs. Now the criterion is, if the posteriors are too broad, you are very imprecise, crudely approximating, then the kernel is small. If they are too concentrated, then they have high values, but the high values do not agree. You will see this on the next slide, and the criterion, which is a mutual information for actually measuring the information content of algorithms, is the logarithm of the cardinality of your output space. So that is the space of all labelings. I talk about discrete spaces to avoid measure-theoretic problems. And then you have this multiplication with this number, and the kernel is between 0 and 1. So this kernel, when it's 1, gives you the full information content of your output space, and otherwise it gives you a reduced information content because certain solutions cannot be reliably distinguished. You have to take the expectation over all pairs x prime and x double prime, and then you take the kernel at the best resolution, which is here parameterized by the time of the algorithm. And that's now the optimal probability distribution. The learning problem from a theoretical point of view, here you see the demonstration. If you look at the kernel, for this beta value, beta is the inverse temperature, you have the 2 Gaussians nicely approximating, agreeing, but they are very broad, and that's why you have a small kernel value. At the other extreme, as I said, here you have very, very committed posteriors, but they commit to the wrong, they are not agreeing with each other, that's why the kernel is small, and somewhere in between you have the optimal overlap. The learning of an algorithm, the challenge is that we now have to have a set of different algorithms. They all have optimal resolutions for the output space, and you have to compare them. So my suggestion is choose the probability distribution which at the optimal resolution, max t, selects the algorithm A, which has the largest value of this expectation and the complexity measure for your cost function. So we don't know what the probability distribution of the data are. So what you have to do is you have to take an expectation over x prime, x double prime, and since you can't evaluate that, you have to lower bound it in the sense of statistical learning theory by a sample average over L pairs of data, and you have to pay a penalty. Now the challenge is I don't know what this penalty is, but I know a lot of theoretical computer scientists in statistical learning theory, and they are good, they could help us in doing that. And for our experiments, which I will show you later on, the L, the capital L, was 1. I just used a pair of samples and evaluated then the correct precision for that pair. Now, where did people do something like this? I believe that a lot what people do in statistical physics is along these lines. If you have an experimentalist and he was working for years and years to synthesize a new material, and now he is finally proud to have this microcube of the new material, you cannot ask these experimentalists to produce another 10,000 of these microcubes just to get your statistics right. He will throw you out of the lab. You have to do something with 1 or with 2 of these samples. And that's basically the strategy which we are following. And it's feasible because the input space is much, much larger than the output space. And it has a lot of redundancy which you exploit for the type of questions you want to answer. That's why it's working. It's not a statistical miracle, it's the contraction of measure phenomenon which underlies all statistical estimation. So where are we in this roadmap? We come to the experiments. And I have a number of different experiments. The ones in neuroscience are quite nice, and let me focus on the middle one, that is diffusion tensor imaging. So this one here is interpreting the tissue, is interpreting transmission electron microscopy images from brains and then reconstructing the geometry. This one here is on a phenomenological level. If I have enough time, I will talk a little bit about FMRI analysis, but let's first look into this. Again, for diffusion-weighted tensor imaging analysis, you have such a pipeline. You start out with the brain and you take these measurements here. So you get here the scanner data. These are these diffusion-weighted images. Now you convert this in these diffusion tensor constructions, so you have per voxel a diffusion tensor. Then you use a fiber tracking algorithm to know which voxel talks to which other voxel. So where is the presumably hypothesized information transport? Then you want to sort of group all these different cables into groups, and you have a clustering problem based on this dissimilarity matrix, and then you want to color the respective area in the brain. And our friends from the neurosciences, they tell us that this is at least something which is valuable to monitor some diseases, in particular Parkinson. I think this has some promise, but also to make progress on basic neuroscience understanding. What is typical for these types of pipelines? You have algorithms here, you have algorithms here. You have fierce fights between people who have developed different tracking algorithms, what parameter, what strategy you should use. And everything will finally have an impact on your output. If you want to automatically generate these algorithms, you need a criterion. Otherwise, you are not in business. So how do you do that? Here you have a schematic view of the macaque brain. You see which areas are talking to which other areas. You convert this in a graph representation as we are used to in computer science. And then you have to do something, some kind of coarsening of this graph representation to get the meta-information of the clusters out of it. Let's look in a very simplistic way how this works. Here is the brain. We look at this small area here of neurons in this region here. Then you map this representation, who is connected to whom, in a Euclidean space using multidimensional scaling. That's just for visualization purposes. And if you start looking at the resolution A, this is this picture, then you have underfitting. Here you have overfitting because you have 3 different clusters where 2 would be sufficient. And here you have the right resolution. And what you see here is that you get this fractal decomposition of one of the segments. This is fluctuation driven. You should not believe in it. So you need a method which tells you 2 is the right answer here and 3 is the wrong answer. So let's look at this. This is now a more complex simulation. Here we are interested in a coloring like this. Here you see a dissimilarity between the different regions, since we are working with histogram characterizations of our connectivity patterns, the connectivity similarities. You have to visualize the similarity using a comparison of empirical probability distributions. And if you start with the simulation, it looks like this. I have to go back. So at very low resolution, you have no differentiation. The information content is now growing. This is the bits per voxel, which you can extract. There is a maximum, and then you go down again. What you also see is the variability of the algorithmic behavior. So these are the confidence intervals at the respective resolution. The confidence intervals get large. If you do underfitting, you are fairly sure that you see the signal, no variation. When you do overfitting, you get this variability, this instability, and that's what you have to detect. And so if you wait until the very end, you see that the coloring is fractionated here. The coloring was fractionated, and that's, oh, I have 10 minutes. So let's skip this and see how we can determine the right resolution. My next example is from analyzing gene expression data. You have a number of gene expression data are these matrices with similarities or dissimilarities in there. These are from yeast genes. You have a whole range of different clustering algorithms which are based on spectral methods to dissect a graph into k different clusters. And even worse, you have also different pre-processing steps to generate the graph. And so here you have the methods. I printed the formulas small so that they cannot be read. It should just give you a feeling that these are all combinatorial optimization problems. People have written tons of papers on the different methods. Why do you believe that one method is the best for these types of data? Probably you have to adapt the method to the data. So let's see how that looks like. If you now plot the information content extracted by a particular algorithm as a function of the number of initial clusters, it's starting to grow, but you get a clear ranking, and you see this algorithm here saturates at about 1.5 bits per voxel, or per node, and in this case it means genes. If you use a different pre-processing measure, correlation clustering, correlation dissimilarity, and not this path-based dissimilarity, you get the same ranking, but look at the scale, the information content. And so path-based clustering, path-based distances are doing a much better job in denoising these matrices. You see that at the faster decay of the power spectrum. And so the lesson to be learned for Euclidean distances, it's about the same as for correlation distances. The lesson to be learned is the pre-processing makes a factor of 2 in difference in resolution, which means in bit rate. That is where most people don't even write a paper about it. They write the paper about the methods, and the discrimination abilities of the methods is much lower than the pre-processing in this particular experiment. So the lesson to be learned is we have to take responsibility for the full pipeline and not just where you can publish. So parameter adaptation for ratio cut. Here you have 2 different parameters, you have to search for the best values. The next one is interesting because I usually thought for a long time that correlation clustering is really not a good method. And the reason was we never looked in this parameter range, -100. We were looking between ±10 of a shift. And for that shift value, the method is really lousy and it only gives you 2 clusters. For this parameter, which is optimally adapted to the nature of our gene expression, yeast expression data, for this parameter value, it was the winning method. And these types of explorations of parameter spaces of algorithms, that has to be done automatically. So the next example is an algorithm which is not even governed by a cost function, but by an evolutionary dynamics. And you see there's again a clear maximum at the right resolution. Here you have underfitting and here you have overfitting. Yeah. So let me skip the last. Okay, this is a case, a brain teaser for computer scientists. We built a graph which was a superposition of a bipartite graph and a 2-click graph. So the labeling method could be either max cut or min cut. And what you see when you have such a mixture distribution for your graph, you see for both interpretations ranges where it's working as a function of the noise level, and you get for max cut 0.8 bits or 0.75 bits, and for min cut you get 1 bit at the right resolution. So the min cut node is dominant in this particular graph. What you should report to your customers is basically there is a min cut nature and a max cut nature in this graph, and the distribution over both modes is what counts. So since I have left very little time, let me skip this. This was an experiment on interpreting fMRI data for getting more insight into schizophrenic patients and how they might be analyzed with dynamical systems. Again, it's a pipeline where you monitor local activity patterns as a function of time. These activity patterns are modeled by dynamic causal models, ODEs, with a certain causality interpretation. And what you find out when you adopt these types of models for the brain regions is that the system finds 3 distinct dynamical systems, 3 clusters of dynamical systems, which are now hypothesized to be subtypes of the spectrum disease in schizophrenia. So our colleagues in the neurosciences are looking into this. So what is missing? Well, it's exactly the scientific method, because no human in this application can tell you what should come out. You have to validate these algorithms, because otherwise the algorithms will be misguided when they are adapting themselves. Let me come back to my question, quo vadis artificial intelligence? Right now we have a fight in the field for the right concepts, and on one hand they are the symbolists, and on the other hand they are the connectionists. So the symbolists are those who believe that in the line of research with expert systems, you can generate intelligent behavior by programming. The good thing is that we know that inference is done by a rule-based system and logic calculus. The problem is you have to do knowledge engineering. And the knowledge engineering is to invent the right symbols. None of these systems works when you don't know what the symbols are. In some sense, that's exactly what you do when you go for deep learning architectures. The network learns from the statistics of the data autonomously what the symbols are. And that's the way to go. Yes, we want to understand as humans because we are still better than these networks in generalizing, but these networks operate in domains where we can't even memorize a model. How do you want to then understand it when you can't memorize it? But you can control it, and that's the essence. Also, these systems have to, in the sense of the scientific method, make predictions. So, let me just say that challenge really is intelligence. What makes us humans is not communication or tool usage. It's not social behavior. According to the cultural drive hypothesis, it's high fidelity information transmission across generations, teaching across generations. We humans have been so precise, according to the cultural drive hypothesis, that we build languages of our own behavior. And that is what intelligence is all about. It's counterfactual reasoning. No animal takes a spear and practices throwing the spear at a target so that when you really have to hit your target when hunting or in fights, that you actually can do this type of exercise. That's what you have not observed. And I think this is what real intelligence is about. So there's a very nice Scientific American summarizing some of these ideas. AI will then follow when we have understood human intelligence better. So what are the lessons learned? Algorithms are models of posteriors, they localize in solution space. Learning requires the validation of algorithms. I think that's the core of everything, because algorithms are the heart of concrete mathematics. And they are sort of dominating this game. The visualization should allow us to discover patterns and in particular to extract the knowledge which is in our heads and convert them into knowledge for the machines. And this is an absolutely non-trivial process. And please visualize uncertainties. That's where humans are extremely bad in estimating the uncertainties of outputs. So the message I would like to convey is these algorithms are characterized by what I call a generalization capacity, and you have to adapt the parameters to maximize this capacity, sort of to make them optimally sensitive to the signal and maximally robust with respect to the fluctuations. And that gives you a structure-specific notion of information. That's what we lost in the 50s when we threw out semantics from information calculus. It's all about the syntax, but no longer about the semantics, and we have to bring that back. And so I believe one of the greatest questions in our field, what is the relation between statistical complexity and computational complexity? And so in the end, my last slide is sort of a reminder, are humans inferior computing machines? I think the challenge, and that's why the excitement or the fear in the general population of AI is so great. Artificial intelligence changes fundamentally our worldview. We never perceived ourselves as power machines or as running machines, but we always thought that we are probably thinking machines. And now we can substitute at an even better inference performance with algorithms for that. So we have to come to grips with that revolution, and we have to sort of give people a feeling where to stand in. And there is also a metaphysical challenge, and I would say, just to remind us, in our universities, there is not only the engineering and the natural science and the mathematics, there are also the humanities, and in particular there's also theology. So you can give many different answers. You might give here from a committed atheist, Homo Deus. You know, Yuval Harari has laid out how he thinks the future might look like. Or you go to the different religions, which are also giving answers to that. But it's a great chance. We live in, I think we live in exciting times because we fundamentally touch upon what makes us humans with these technologies, and we have to reshape our thinking around these questions. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Joachim, for this really inspiring, interesting talk. We have a little bit time for a few questions, so if you have questions, please line up at the microphone, state your name and your affiliation, and ask a short question if possible. Okay, there are not yet. Okay. Min? Jenny, please.
I have to ask a question, and really, it's very, very insightful talk, very inspirational. And I'm particularly interested, you mentioned that the one way to validate algorithm is to using the reconstruction approach to reconstruct it from the sort of decision space back to the data space. That possibly also one of the best mechanisms to validate things we don't quite know how it works, the algorithms, we don't have, it's a human algorithm, how visualization works. So that could be the exactly same information theoretical framework for both algorithms and the human algorithms.
Sure. If you want to reconstruct your input space, fine. My opinion is this is a too difficult question. Because why do you do information processing, automatic information processing in the first place? Because you want to get rid of a lot of information in your input. You see, the big problem in learning is not so much to distinguish signal from noise. The big problem is to distinguish relevant signal for solving your task from irrelevant signal which helps you to do something else. That is what we don't understand. And for this, we need tools. So there is a huge parameter range in where you have no chance to reconstruct your input, but you have a very good chance to estimate the optimal probability distribution for your outputs. And that is, for example, in medicine the case. I don't think that the patients want to have a digital reconstruction of their biopsies. They want to know what is the right therapy and what is the right prognosis.
The main reason for that is when you order to decide that a decision is good or bad, you have to use a third-party function to do that.
Yes.
When economists told me that in economics, you can never have a criteria to determine a decision is good or bad. It may be good for once, may not be good for a year, may not be good for 5 years. So the best validation might still consider information theoretically, not necessarily exactly in terms of numerical value, is sort of probabilistically how the reconstruction works better. In fact, you're using it, you use mutual information
exactly
to do it. So you are using that.
Maybe I should have stressed this point better. There are two ways of validating things. There's the scientific validation and there's the statistical validation. I was only talking about the statistical validation because nobody knows how to validate the hypothesis class. I take the hypothesis class as given. But if you give me high-dimensional biological data or financial data, should I do a clustering in a 100,000 dimensional space, or should I do a dimension reduction? This is a question for which I believe in principle there are also automatic guiding principles, but that is completely not touched by me. And for this we always need the humans. But if you don't know how to, what kind of answers you would accept, if the hypothesis class is not clear, you cannot do anything anyway.
He's looking behind me. Could I ask another question? So, have you considered the probability, the chance your original data space didn't quite model all the variables, maybe involving in the algorithm needed? Say, in a lot of, say, decision conditions, say, the governments or whatever, they need to make decision, not all the sort of variable were captured in the data you have. So when the algorithm make those things sort of happen, there are certain variables somehow you can't even put in the sort of database. Say, for example, without a human, certain person is reliable or not reliable, you can't really say sort of put it into the database for everyone, say don't use it because it's not reliable. And how this sort of decision be made with both human and algorithm together.
So if you have latent variables which you want to discover, then these latent variables should be represented in the hypothesis class. If they are not in the hypothesis class, you will not discover that with that framework. But we kind of did something like this by having we looked at the security problem, role-based access control in security. And there we compared single assignment clustering algorithms with multi-assignment clustering algorithms. So we had already a cascade of different hypothesis classes. And it was very clear that those hypothesis classes which matched the problem much better were winning in terms of this criterion. But the theory does not capture that yet. You can just apply it and see what's coming out. But it's very clear these are the challenges. However, they are all governed by algorithms. So an algorithm will start to hallucinate what kind of model extensions might be most informative with respect to the task, and then it will explore these model extensions. And that's the way I see that. Because algorithms can come up with explore this model space in a much more efficient way.
Would you consider using the framework you have to also study human algorithms as well?
Oh, sure. The human, if you observe the behavior of an algorithm, if you observe the dynamics of the human decision making and phrase it as an algorithm, you could also judge it like this. And we know that the doctors are not as good as our algorithms when it comes to estimating the Kaplan-Meier plots.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Walter Meulmans, TU Eindhoven. This was really interesting, and I think that the way of thinking about this is very important to get algorithms maybe very ingrained in this kind of work here as well. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about how this relates to the stability for computational reasoning, where rather than thinking about, we're talking about you have an input space that is probabilistic and your output space is probabilistic. Where rather than I replace those with metric spaces, so I just have metrics that will tell me how far apart are these inputs, and I can think about how far apart are the outputs that I get with some algorithm. Then the idea of stability being small differences in inputs are small differences in output.
Yeah. Okay, from a mathematical point of view, the situation is much less formalized as you indicate in your question. If you have an algorithm, you may have a topology in the input space, you may even have a metric in the input space because you have an idea how your data are generated. The algorithm does not necessarily impose a metric or a topology on the output space. An algorithm is a point-to-point mapping, and it could be extremely bizarre. So when you refer to stability, that's one of the guiding principles, but you have to trade off stability against informativeness, because the null pointer is the most stable mapping. So it's completely useless. So a clustering algorithm which invests 50 clusters can afford a little bit more mistakes than a clustering algorithm committing only to 2 clusters. And this somehow has to be traded one against the other. And such a theory would allow you to do that. Because you saw that at the maximum, I always had the maximal number of cluster centroids in coloring my brain parcellation. But these implicit degrees of freedom will not be used because the cluster centers were sitting on top of each other. And only if you go to extremely low temperature, extremely high precision, then you differentiate. But then you are starting to read the tea leaves, and that's exactly what you want to avoid.
Thanks.
So we're focusing on information, right? There's a dichotomy here between relevant or irrelevant or signal and noise, right? But there's also a mismatch between sort of structures of power and how this data is collected, right? Like organizations with more power can collect more data, and organizations with more technical sophistication can make better use of this data. And right, some of these problems have very, very large ethical impacts from people who may be unable to explain what's going on to them, right? So I was wondering how you consider ethics and transparency when you're choosing which problems to solve, and how you can maybe utilize some of the expertise of people in this room to communicate the impact of your findings to stakeholders.
It's very clear that visualization is one of the essential tools to keep the human in the loop, and that's why I had this slide in the beginning where I think one would need visualization. So as a society, we hope that we are under control of our decisions, but a lot of the decisions are made very intuitively, and so dealing with these types of algorithms will go in the same direction. It's nice if you understand your algorithm, but it's not sufficient to have a decision tree with Boolean functions at each of the nodes. Because if I go to a depth of 50, you have 2 to the 50 different decisions. You even can't parse in your lifetime these logical formula. So it's in the eye of the beholder what we mean by understanding. And my populistic example is, if we would have, with the understandability request today for AI, if we would have progressed in developing the automotor in the same way, we wouldn't have an automotor today, because we still don't understand the combustion processes of gasoline in the engine. So what matters is that you have these tools under control and you can predict consequences. And all the ethics, and a good deal of or let's put it this way, some of the ethical problems which we see today are misuse of the technology. If you have an atypical sampling of your input data, don't be surprised that the output data is biased. And in the same way, even if you have a typical sampling but your population is biased, the algorithm will learn the behavior of the population. This is a societal problem, because we have to come to grips with what is a bias and what is our personal choices. So from the technology point of view, I think we should be agnostic, but we should actually educate the people that a lot of our lifestyle, especially with digitalization, a lot of our lifestyle was secured by technical incompetence. And this technical incompetence is going away very rapidly. And that's why you see all these people who are manipulating democracies and so on. And we don't like that. But we also didn't secure that.
Okay, so thank you very much. I think this was a nice statement. That is all for you. Very nice presentation.